Ronald Reagan, President of the United States, and Mikhail Gorbachev, General Secretary of the Soviet Union, were the respected leaders of their countries at the time. Their calm and cool-headed manner in a time of struggle allowed them to negotiate a deal that would end the arms race and prevent a third world war. The struggles they went through to prevent a nuclear war are shown in their summit meetings. The summit meetings between Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan helped improve relations between the US and the Soviet Union, which eventually led to the end of the Cold War. By the late 1970s, the Cold War had been going on for 30 years, and people began to say that America was in retreat. President Jimmy Carter increased defense spending to $134 billion in 1980. Carter would not be re-elected, and the Republican candidate, California Governor Ronald Reagan, took his place. Reagan was strongly anti-communist, writing, "Every Soviet leader up to and including Brezhnev has sworn to carry out to the letter the words of Lenin, who said, 'It will not matter if 3/4 of the human race perished. The important thing is the remaining 1/4 be communist.'" When the events at the Chernobyl reactor in the Soviet Union took place, Reagan said, "Chernobyl means Armageddon in the Ukrainian Bible." Reagan increased the defense budget to $253 billion. He also created the Strategic Defense Initiative, also called SDI or Star Wars by those who opposed it. The SDI program was tasked with creating a ballistic missile defense system. SDI gave the US leverage over the Soviet Union, as the Soviets knew that if the system became fully functional, they would have no chance in a war, as their investment into their missile program would be wasted. SDI also had a large effect on the USSR, as it caused the Soviets to become more modern, which is only achievable by liberalization. This is one reason Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. The Perestroika movement was the Soviets' answer to having to be more liberal. Gorbachev was more open to Western ideas than his predecessors. His glasnost reform helped to give the Soviet people a voice. On November 19, 1985, Reagan and Gorbachev met in Geneva, Switzerland. This was the two leaders' first time meeting together to discuss arms control. Before he left, Reagan said, "My mission, stated simply, is a mission for peace." Gorbachev was new to his position as Secretary General, having held the position for only 8 months. In fact, just hours after the U.S. learned that Gorbachev had become Secretary General of the Soviet Union, the Reagan administration scheduled the meeting with the new leader. The proposition came even before the Americans knew of Gorbachev's position. Reagan, however, was determined to reach an arms reduction agreement. At the meeting, he proposed a 50% arms reduction rate and the eventual end of European intermediate-range missiles. Gorbachev said he would agree to this, but only if the U.S. could end its SDI program. Reagan, of course, objected to this, and no agreement was reached. However, one important thing did happen at the summit. It was decided that 2 more summit meetings would take place by 1987. It also opened up the two leaders to being able to work together, which was a different approach than their predecessors. No arms agreement took place at the Geneva summit, but in the words of Gorbachev, because of the Geneva summit, the world has become a more secure place. The most iconic of the summit meetings took place on the 11th of October, 1986. It was a bleak October day, where the sun shone for only a few hours. The historic Hofty House, where the meeting took place, was not ideal for a conference between the leaders of the two most powerful nations. The area around it had no vegetation, and the building was small, with rooms such as bathrooms being used for machines such as typewriters. Reagan was now more determined to come to an agreement, saying when asked what he wanted from the Russians, "I want to get rid of those atomic weapons. Every one." Reagan also wanted the meeting to be more businesslike, minimizing social activities with the Secretary General. Most issues were being resolved until the topic of SDI came up. Reagan continued to push his agenda that SDI could be shared with the Russians, but Gorbachev was skeptical, saying, "If you will not share oil drilling equipment or even milk processing factories, I do not believe you will share SDI." The main problem with SDI was the ABM, or Anti-Ballistic Missile Agreement, signed in 1972. What the ABM accomplished was prohibiting deployment of any missile system. Reagan believed in a broad interpretation of ABM, which allowed SDI to be developed and tested as long as the means were other physical matters such as laser and particle beams. Nonetheless, Gorbachev was in favor of a less broad interpretation, one that excluded the deployment of the Strategic Defense Initiative program. SDI came to be the one thing that ruined the chances of an agreement at Reykjavik. Secretary of State George Shultz said Gorbachev had laid gifts at our feet, or accurately, on the table, concession after concession. This was true, as the leader had dropped the time for ABM from 20 years to 5, agreed to the inclusion of human rights issues in arms talks, an agreement that nuclear weapons should not belong in the world. Yet, neither leader would budge on SDI, and thus an arms agreement in Reykjavik was not meant to be. Reagan's liberal critics in the press attacked him for not coming to an agreement. They believed SDI, and not arms reduction, had become the major issue in the talks. The Reykjavik summit was not exactly what the press made it out to be. Reagan stood firm to make sure that the deal that was best for the U.S. passed. He did what not many other people would have done at the time, by not accepting a deal as opposed to any deal just to improve his own image. His patience would pay off over a year later. In the months after Reykjavik, a disarmament treaty between the Soviet Union and the United States was written. All that was left now was for it to be signed. On December 8, 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan began their meeting in the East Wing of the White House. The public was excited to see Gorby in their Washington. Gorbachev made a spectacle out of it, stopping his limousine on Connecticut Avenue to shake hands with a delighted crowd. Of course, there was some opposition to the summit. Conservatives like Paul Weyrich and future Vice Presidents Dan Quayle and Dick Cheney opposed the talks. For reasons like Europe being powerless and the Soviet Union being the ones with a position of strength coming into the talks. They're almost right, as the meeting was almost a disaster because of a few of Reagan's anti-communist jokes. But the issues were resolved, and Reagan refrained from these antics in the future. In fact, contrary to some beliefs, Reagan was the one in power at the meetings. When Gorbachev talked about the importance of trade, Reagan would not talk about trade agreements unless human rights were talked about first. With Gorbachev having shown his hand, the clocks went quickly, lasting only 3 days. On December 10th, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed by both leaders. Neither leader talked about SDI in their statements after the meeting. Both leaders agreed to limiting each country to 4,900 ballistic missiles. The INF Treaty was seen as a success by both nations. The editors of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, whose magazine features the well-known Doomsday Clock, announced the hands of the clock would be set back because of the treaty. Another summit was set for 1988. The Moscow Summit of June 1988 was purely celebratory. Reagan was allowed to speak to a large group at the Moscow State University. Of the many things he could show the crowd, he holds up a small computer chip. He goes on to talk about a technological and information revolution going on at the time. This was the final stand Reagan took against communism. By showing his people the wonders of modern technology, it forced the USSR to become more modern. With the people in support of Reagan, the Soviet Union began its slow fall. By the end of 1991, 3 years later, the Soviet Union had officially dissolved. When Reagan left office, the U.S. was more powerful than ever. When Gorbachev left office, his state had lost all power. At the beginning of the summit meetings in 1985, the Cold War was at its highest point. After its climax at Reykjavik, the tensions began to go down. At the Washington summit, the two men began to see things in a different light. Their similarities far outweighed their differences. After all, they both had one goal in mind: nuclear disarmament. Because of Reagan and Gorbachev, nuclear Armageddon was averted. The Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev summit meetings helped improve U.S.-Soviet relations and led to the eventual end of the Cold War. Mikhail Gorbachev took a stand against the doctrines of his predecessors by opening up relations with U.S. Ronald Reagan took a stand against communism by not giving them an inch and causing them to become more liberalized. Reagan would not give up the U.S.'s only chance of winning the arms race, SDI, just for the sake of an arms agreement. Gorbachev understood the only way the Soviet Union would last was for the people to have more freedoms. In the end, though, it didn't come quick enough, as the nation dissolved in the early 90s. Ronald Reagan won the Cold War for the U.S., averted World War III, and put an end to the world's largest communist state. Reagan and Gorbachev were two men who took a stand in history.